Hello, and welcome back to Promotional Whitenoise and my list of the top 121 video games of all time. We've already done 10. We're 10 through. We've got another 5 today. We've covered the 80s, 1990. It's time for 1991 today. Oh, 1991. Ah, the good old days. The bliss of childhood. Let's go back and have a look. See what was happening in 1991. Hang on, just let me get some stuff pulled.
During 1991, 7,731 businesses failed in London. That's up 48.1%.
Oh no.
The attacks on these stores in Tottenham Court Road yesterday were the work of the IRA.
Oh man, okay.
And the rioters finally took control of the centre of the estate by chopping down trees with chainsaws.
Oh, that's not great. What about...
The Gulf crisis finally became the Gulf War at about 11:30 British time last night.
Oh, that's rough. That's rough.
There's often trains which are late. They get in about half an hour, 40 minutes late with not much explanation. And there's a reduction in staff recently, a reduction in rolling stock, which means that often people have got to stand between Lewis and Victoria.
What the... I don't remember any of this.
Right now, you'll find a bacon or sausage and egg McMuffin, and any regular hot drink, or even a big breakfast. Each under £1. At McDonald's.
Ah, there we go. Thankfully. So we're starting to move into the 90s proper, but we're not entirely free of the 80s just yet. I'm still regularly dropping a lot of coin in the arcades because I'm just that cool. Not just in Whitley Bay though. Another important arcade hotspot for me as a kid was Scarborough, another seaside town my family used to go on holiday to. I remember having all kinds of other things lined up. Aquariums, shows, rides... Scarborough Fair. I remember going to see Bobby Davro in Scarborough.
The shampoo adverts, they annoy me. Have you seen that one with that woman? I had to have a baby before I found out what shampoo to use for my hair. I thought, blimey, her chemist drives a hard bargain.
That was how incredible my holidays were as a kid. Yeah, you'd be jealous. But even with all that going on, I only really wanted to get into the arcades. I remember specifically playing bingo with my grandma here. Really fond memories. The sunshine outside streaming in. It tended to be quite sunny in Scarborough. It tends to be on the coast. I remember in one of those games of bingo, she won me a little LCD game of a penalty shootout. I played that game for hours and hours, and I played it for years. Sadly, that game does not feature here on the list of the 121 best games of all time, but a couple more arcade games do, and the first one is The Simpsons.
We last left Bart Simpson battling deadly space mutants and Acclaim's best-selling video game Bart versus the Space Mutants. And now it's Bart versus the world!
Presumably, you've heard about this cartoon show called The Simpsons. After its full proper TV debut in 1989, it blew up massive in the 90s. Those of us who look back on the show fondly now mostly think of it as a really funny and really insightful satire that was biting and it was bold and it was willing to put every little detail and every foible of society, American society specifically, in its crosshairs. But that was mostly confined to the seasons where Homer became the main character, and it was aimed at a general audience from around season 3 to, depending on who you talk to, around 9 or 13. So up to about the early 2000s. But in its first couple of seasons, it largely appealed to kids, with Bart being perceived as the main character and the figurehead of a craze. Do you remember crazes? There were crazes all the time. It's like now when some paid Russian influencer drinks out of an overpriced cup and then young people here in the West can't steal them fast enough. That's what a craze is. Used to have them all the time. Bart Simpson was everywhere, so Bart Simpson merchandise was everywhere. And naturally there were a spate of video games trying to cash in on the whole thing.
Look for a winning Simpsons video game for every system.
Don't forget Krusty's Funhouse.
But realistically, most were terrible, some were bad, only one was ever any good, and it's the one you couldn't play at home. The arcade game came out right around the beginning of Season 2, so it was well timed to cash in, and there was often a queue of people waiting to get on when I was trying to play this thing in the arcades. Much as the Turtles arcade game had done, also made by Konami of course, this one makes use of the co-op gameplay to use every member of the family, so depending on where you put your coins in the machine, as there were different places to stand for who you wanted to play as, you could play as Bart, Homer, Marge or Lisa, and if you had 3 friends, which I did not, you could all play together. There were unique team-up moves as well that encouraged this, which was a cool idea at the time, but overall it was just another side-scrolling beat-em-up. The reason it stands out in the cultural consciousness of people my age is because of the fidelity to the TV show. Konami worked the same magic here as they had with the Turtles game. They understood that the selling point of these adaptations was authenticity and fidelity to the original source. It just looked so much like you were playing an episode, it was difficult not to be impressed, particularly compared to the home Simpsons games coming out at the time, which were all pretty rough looking. The game uses big, colourful sprites, which were a bit cleaner and a bit more well drawn than even the Turtle sprites from just a couple of years ago. Tons of characters and references from the show were there, and it applies some new tech too. You have a lot of the big sort of Mode 7 scaling and rotation in and out of the screen, and keeps it feeling a bit new and different from what you could play at home. It has the theme tune, of course, and it just became a comforting thing to see and hear in your local arcade, even if you weren't playing it. The idle animation, the idle sort of loop video that it would play, and the music, I just liked knowing it was there. It even takes a pretty impressive stab at recreating the entire opening of the TV show in pixel form. Everyone gets a little quote here as well that sort of fits with their character. Whoa, what? Okay, that's a bit dark, but I still didn't get the tone exactly right. I also think that it's among the more forgiving games of its kind. The characters move really quickly in comparison to other beat-em-ups, which means it's easier to do hit-and-run tactics, and that's especially useful in boss fights. Yeah, obviously it eventually floods you out of your money with impossible waves of enemies, and the hit points of the final bosses are a bit of a joke, but I remember getting a decent amount of play for my 2 or 3 20p pieces. It's a shame some of its most creative ideas come later on when the challenge has been ramped up to frustrating levels. The Dreamland sequence is particularly good, although it really only makes sense if you're playing as Homer. Like, why would Lisa's Dreamland be full of bowling balls and donuts? Ultimately, the proof of the quality of this game lies in just how sought after it continues to be. People were thrilled to see a release on Xbox Live back in 2012, and similarly gutted when some unknown issues, probably about licensing, caused it to be removed barely a year later. And it's an absolute stalwart of any retro arcade you visit nowadays. I actually played this in a real arcade as recently as last month. It's a hell of a lot better than the show has been for the last 15 years.
Kids can be so cruel. We can? Thanks, Mom. Ow! Cut out, Bart!
Now, I said we weren't entirely free of the 1980s just yet, and here's the proof. Now let me tell you something, brother.
Good morning.
It's just a thought that occurs to me. You're not Mike Morris's long-lost brother, are you, by any chance?
Well, I think maybe he might be my younger brother, but he's got just a little bit too much hair.
In April, you can see your wrestling heroes in the flesh and in your face. Grab yourself a seat when the WWF Superstars make their presence felt at a venue near you.
I loved wrestling. How much did I love wrestling? I loved it so much I had a wrestling buddy that me and my friends did moves on. Actually, loads of kids did that. That wasn't special. I loved wrestling so much that I stayed up until 3 a.m. as an 11-year-old watching WrestleMania live. Yeah, we all did that too. Everyone did that too. I loved wrestling so much that I owned, listened to, and still sometimes listen to, the WWF album, where wrestlers awkwardly stumble through some generic 90s pop. Yeah, now you know how deep my problem was. And no, Brett, there has never been a right time to say goodbye. WWF Wrestling, as it was at the time, had exploded in popularity towards the end of the 1980s in the States. It did this by leaning into the colourful, wacky characters that appealed to kids, so the biggest stars in wrestling history were cemented in this period. Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, Macho Man Randy Savage, Bret Hitman Hart, and the British Bulldog, among others. As ever, the UK sort of trailed a little bit behind America in terms of the craze time period. Oh yeah, this is another craze. So for kids in the UK, it was the early 90s when we really got into it. Which, in fairness, was a little bit past its prime, but most people accept that the wrestling craze here in the UK really hit its peak in 1992, when they held SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium. That meant that 1991 was the perfect time to release an arcade game utilising those larger-than-life colourful characters and trying to recreate, to some degree, the TV presentation, and that's what this game did better than any before it. This is actually a follow-up to a game called WWF Superstars, and in terms of gameplay it's almost identical. Actually, because it seems a lot of people in the gaming space on the internet are of a quite specific age, Wrestlefest gets a lot of love without really mentioning Superstars, which is essentially the same game mechanically. But you can see the difference in quality of the visuals, which are a very important aspect of this. With wrestling being predetermined, the show is really the thing. It's not about the fighting so much as it is about the soap opera, the performances, and the showbiz presentation. So arguably that presentation is the most vital aspect of any adaptation into video game form. That's why here we have these beautifully drawn Mean Gene Okerlund backstage interviews with the Legion of Doom, or behind his announce desk in a recreation of the weekly TV show, announcing your chosen characters as tag champs at the end of the game. Gameplay wise, it's a button masher, there's no getting around that. There's a punch, a kick, and a grapple. While in a grapple, pounding the buttons faster than your opponent means you win and get to perform moves like the suplexes, pile drivers, etc. Again, on the presentation side, these characters come with an animation for their famous finishing moves, which was a really nice novelty at the time. And there was also a really sneaky coin hoovering mechanic where putting in new credits didn't just give you more lives to try again, but actually replenished your entire health instantly while you were in a match. The utter bastards. The object was to get through 5 stages of tag team action to ultimately challenge the Legion of Doom for the titles. Or you could choose Royal Rumble mode, where you try and stay in the ring and be the last man, but there was no story or cutscenes there, so there wasn't much point to it. Also, it could fuck right off with its immediate eliminations. Nice touches here and there, such as being able to go outside the ring and use weapons. Plus they have a few different ring setups to keep things looking fresh in the Tag Champs mode, including one inside a steel cage. And that one is cool because it changes the gameplay slightly. It makes whipping your opponent against the ropes a proper attack instead of a setup. This is very simple, no one's arguing anything other, but surprisingly playable even today with the far more advanced recreations of wrestling out there in the SmackDown vs Raw games and the WWE 2K series. Like all the arcade games in this list, this one is a reflection of its time, and it's a time I look back on very fondly. And this one actually followed me home, because I loved the wrestling so heckin' much, guys. Yes, we're back on the Game Boy. Because going to the arcades was great, but you couldn't do it all the time. The dream was to have those games in your home, and if you could have them on the go, even better. Having these games at home had only ever been true to a limited degree. This was an era where home ports of arcade games had been quite ropey for a long time. This is 1991, remember. This one's no different. It's a very shallow and limited port of the original WWE arcade game, Superstars, that we just mentioned, when judged as a port. But if instead you just look at it as an early Game Boy game with a juicy WWF flavour, it's surprisingly enjoyable. I know what you're thinking, it looks rough. On the surface it is very shallow, there are only 5 characters. There's a punch, a kick and a throw, they're the only direct commands. And obviously it's not possible to have the lovely colourful TV style presentation on the monochrome Game Boy. But, with all that said, there's a surprising amount of detail and depth here. There's a good amount of dialogue written for every possible combination of wrestlers, meaning whoever you choose to fight against anyone else, they'll talk to each other in a semi-believable way. Additionally, there's a mechanic to exit the ring and fight on the outside, complete with high-risk moves from the top rope and a quite nail-biting race to get back inside before you get counted out at 10. This all happens from a different camera's perspective with some nice detail. Judicious use of this as a one-off powerful star move that you use up and can only use once per match makes the game a bit more tactical and thoughtful than it appears on the surface. And the same goes for some button combinations that can allow access to moves that aren't just a regular kick and punch. These things don't add up to the most accurate recreation of wrestling ever, but it does make the game a more balanced, interesting and compelling experience than you'd expect from a shameless cash-in on a kid-friendly craze in the early 90s. The way you know this one was a bit of a diamond in the rough, by the way, is by playing the sequels, which were all universally garbage. So yeah, this one's worth a shot. Okay, let's get into the meat of my home console gaming in this era. The Mega Drive was a very exciting machine in 1991. Sega did an incredible job of marketing campaign that set it apart from Nintendo, who had pretty much established themselves as the dominant next-generation platform with the Super NES. We didn't get quite the same directly confrontational marketing they had in the US with the whole Sega does what Nintendo don't stuff, but there was obviously an attempt to make the Mega Drive in particular seem cool to slightly older kids and teens in a way Nintendo could be seen as kind of for kids. I mean, this cool guy in his chair, look how bloody cool he is. He's the Milk Tray Man or something, we want to be like him, in his bizarre sci-fi caravan here. They generated what would have been viral memes if the internet had existed at the time, like the Cyber Razor Cut and Blast Processing. Our version of viral memes was stickers that came in Mean Machine magazine that we used to completely ruin the lovely sleek black lines of our expensive new consoles. Anyway, they put a lot of this new cool attitude into what would go on to become Sega's most enduring character and iconic mascot, Sonic. And it all started here with the first Sonic the Hedgehog.
Once you start playing Sonic the Hedgehog, everything else seems a little bit slow. Don't worry, I'll catch him.
Dr. Ivo Robotnik, the mad scientist, is snatching innocent animals and turning them into evil robots. only one tough dude can put an end to the demented scientist's fiendish scheme. It's Sonic, the real cool hedgehog with the spiked haircut and power sneakers that give him super speed. Yep, it's all about speed and attitude. At least that's what the ads showed, and how it was spoken about in the instruction manual. We mentioned that Sonic wasn't the first game released on the Mega Drive last time out, but this was the reason to buy one. The showcase, if you like. They made up the term blast processing as a way to lie about the console being able to handle the super speed of Sonic, and you simply had to play it.
その名は Sega Sonic The Hedgehog メガドライブで待ってるぜ Sega!
It's not true, of course. In fact, going back to the original Sonic now, you might be surprised at how slow it seems. Sonic's top speed isn't really any higher than a running or flying Mario in Super Mario World over on the SNES, but the levels, at least the early ones, are designed to make it look as though he's going really fast. Actually, the entire history of Sonic games have been described by some as just single, impressive-looking set pieces of speed in the opening level, followed by a pretty traditional, and at times actually frustratingly slow and halting platform game. I can see the value in those criticisms, but there's a bit more to it than that. Yeah, the first level's all fun and games. There isn't much to stop you flying along at top speed through the loop-de-loops and jumping off ramps. And then it does settle into a more challenging test of platforming deftness. But there are times in most zones where a skilled player can use speed as an advantage, not least because there are multiple routes through many stages, and some of the higher ones, with fewer enemies, can only be accessed through going fast. The highlight of this game I actually thought were the boss encounters. There were some pretty imaginative gameplay challenges in the Robotnik fights that end each zone, and there's just 6 of them, but they really stick in the memory. In the days before the internet, trying to find out different strategies and learning what worked against these new machines was pretty fun. I still maintain Springyard's own boss was the hardest one in the whole game with his taking the floor away shenanigans. People have been quite unkind about this game in recent years. Enough times passed that it's now considered one of those not as good as people thought or said at the time games. And that's just rubbish. No, Labyrinth Zone is not that bad. It's not great. If you take your time and are very careful about the spikes and things and don't treat it like you have to just bomb on ahead being fast all the time, there's nothing wrong with Labyrinth. Although Scrap Brain Zone can do one. In between stages, if you have enough rings, you can get into these really trippy psychedelic levels to try and get all the Chaos Emeralds to stop Robotnik having them. And it's worth it because it changes the ending graphic ever so slightly. It kicked off a massive franchise for a reason, and while it might not be the easiest game to play now if you've never played a Sonic game, if you had a feel for the mechanics back then, this is still a very enjoyable game, with much better quality visuals than many of its immediate sequels, which we'll discuss next time. And of course, as with so many of these early games, you can't really talk about how good it is without mentioning the fantastic soundtrack, which actually only gets better as the series goes on, but it's undeniably fantastic even here at the outset. This is especially true if you haven't been mind-broken by emulators playing the game in the US region, and you accept that the slower PAL versions of these tunes are the superior and correct form of the soundtrack.
Oh shit!
So Sonic launched an entire franchise with cartoons and comics and toys, etc. But one of the other best games on the Mega Drive was an adaptation of an existing popular toy franchise.
You can go small, you can go micro, because the micro machines are here. The smallest three-wheelers ever, with dramatic detail, precision paintwork, colossal collectability. Famous names like Chevy, Trans Am, Mercedes, Porsche, Jeep, Camaro, Phantom, Jumbo, Mustang, Bulldozer. That's not a bulldozer, that's a bulldozer. There's Lamborghini, Stingray, Dodge, Barracuda, Corvette. Micro machines come in collections of 5. Micro machines come in collections of 5. Micro machines come in collections of 5. Micro machines come in collections of 5.
It's possible I have a bit of a god complex, I'm starting to realise. I really liked Micro Machines when I was young, which were little toy cars, for those who don't know, but really, really little, like really small toy cars. Micro, you might describe them as. But I didn't just love the cars, they were fine. What I loved were the play sets that recreated a little town. I specifically remember the one that came in what looked like a big van that opened up into a town that seemed to have everything from a sea dock to a racetrack and all that stuff. At least that's how I remembered it, because I used to imagine what life was like in that town. People going about their lives, getting in the car and travelling around. It actually made me feel comforted thinking about that town continuing to live when I wasn't playing with it. I made little signs to change or name certain buildings. It was a magical world to me. This world came to the Mega Drive with Micro Machines in '91 as a pretty simple top-down perspective racing game. With the hardware limitations of the time in 2 dimensions, this was one of 2 options you had for racing games. You either did a from-behind view of a car on a track, you move left and right to avoid obstacles, like in Outrun, or you did a top-down view of a car and had a little more freedom of movement around a track. This one did the latter and fixed the controls and camera so that pressing left on the controller turned the car left from the perspective of the imagined driver, whether the car was moving up, down, left or right on the screen. Those controls were fixed. That was a deal breaker for some people in the same way some could never get away with the character perspective controls, also known as tank controls, in Resident Evil. Personally, it worked for me. I loved it. I spent a lot of time trying to beat all the kid characters in Micro Machines. That was one of the cool aspects of the game, as there were what seemed like a really big number of characters for you to race against, presented as other kids who own Micro Machines toys, and all of them being some kind of interesting stereotype of a school kid. Some of these have aged better than others. And this was all part of the overall theming that didn't pretend the toys were real cars, but instead came up with some fun and imaginative settings for places the kids might be playing with the toys. You start off playing with the boats in the bathtub, for example, with giant bars of soap and rubber ducks to avoid. Then there's 4x4s on the breakfast table, jumping over cereal boxes, and sports cars on the school desk, where pencil sharpeners and erasers will absolutely ruin your day. That stuff sounds pretty obvious now, but it was actually a fresh idea at the time, and it made the game stand out from other racers that aimed for a more real-world setting. It just added a sense of fun and adventure and imagination to it, which actually belied quite a challenging game. Because of the top-down perspective, there was an extent to which you really had to learn the tracks pretty well to stand a chance, especially when you were in the faster vehicles, when you can't entirely rely on your reflexes. By the time you've seen the pool cue in the F1 car, you've already hit it. So you have to know where it is ahead of time and make the adjustments. People tend to dismiss these toy brand tie-ins as just adverts for the product, and certainly I imagine that's a big part of the motivation for making these games, right? Let's be real. But I also think that overlooks an important aspect of the appeal for kids who don't have lots of money to waste buying an entire range of toys. These kind of games allow them to feel like they've got a collection to play with by just getting one thing, the game. The tournament mode even represents this, as you sort of building up your own Micro Machines collection with each race you win, which I thought was pretty cool. The sequels to this game ramped up the difficulty to an insane degree, and that makes them considerably less enjoyable, but this first one is still a cracker if you can handle the fixed controls. By the time the tanks are introduced, it's all gotten a little bit silly, with you all just firebombing each other out of existence. But there is a really nice multiplayer mode here too, which is not just racing each other to see who gets to the finish line first, but scoring points by managing to get a full screen ahead of your opponent. This is different enough from the main challenge because it means you can play tactically. If you think you're going to go off the table, for example, at the next turn, you have to judge whether you think that's going to happen before you reach a screen ahead. And if it's not, you can just bomb ahead and see if you can get the point. Many a friendship will have been ruined by this mode.
Streets of Rage, the fighting game that'll knock your socks off, with 40 individually controllable attack moves, and a neighborhood crawling with punks, muggers, and urban slime.
There was a lot of this in the early 90s, wasn't there? It's interesting. Someone should do some sort of study on how much the young male fantasy has changed. Has it changed? I'm not sure. It certainly feels like back then, a lot of us found it really appealing to be doling out violent vigilante justice to criminal punks. We were super into law enforcement through fists and feet to the face, it turns out. Sega wasn't just going to let Nintendo have the home port of Final Fight without some sort of response. Not when the Mega Drive was the console for super tough dudes with attitude. So we got Streets of Rage, often considered just Sega's version of Final Fight that never appeared in arcades. This was a console exclusive, which made it all the more desirable. The sprites are a bit smaller, obviously, and the backgrounds do a lot of repetitive scrolling, but that kind of game is all pretty much present and accounted for. Plenty of enemies with decent variety, punches, kicks, throws, and absolutely killer music again. Actually, this music is so good, I bet you I could put it to cuts of an amazing cop show. Like, hang on. Yeah, there you go, you see. So, here you've got your three characters, black guy, white guy, and girl guy, translating to strong, balanced, and fast. No boundaries are being broken here, there's no new ground being covered. The one little gameplay wrinkle they threw in to set this apart is that instead of having a special move, where Hagar spins round so hard he literally hurts himself, you get one token per level to use on a call for a backup, screen-clearing support attack. Each character gets their own unique support attack, all of which show up in a cop car at the start of the level and shoot some heavy ordnance into a populated area. It's all good, wholesome stuff. You also get a cool choice at the end if you manage to make it all the way through the bike punks and flying axes. Oh, and these girls. So at the end, the main baddie asks you to join him. In one player, you either say no and fight the last boss, or you say yes and you get tricked by getting demoted back a few stages. But in two-player mode, each player gets to choose, and if they disagree, they fight to the death. The winner then fights the last boss, and if they win, they take over the crime syndicate. That's a pretty cool twist for a game of this era. There are some neat touches here and there too, such as the game taking into account the horizontal nature of your baseball and lead pipe swings, which means you don't have to be exactly in the same 2D plane as your opponent for those attacks to connect. You can also land on your feet after being thrown if you press up and jump quick enough to avoid taking damage. And while, yes, the lift, or for my American friends, elevator level, was a cliche even in 1991, you can throw people off it, which never stops being fun. You can also glass people with what looks like Newcastle Brown Ale bottles, which turns this from a Japanese power fantasy into a Geordie documentary, which I appreciate. While the Mega Drive had a number of quite accurate arcade ports like Altered Beast and Golden Axe, it was ironically this console exclusive that really made me feel like the console was having an arcade machine at home. It would be entirely eclipsed by its own sequel not long after, but we'll get to that another time. For now, know that Streets of Rage is most definitely one of the 121 best games of all time. And that's 1991. I'm sure all that nasty business from the opening of this video will be gone by the time we dive into 1992. And I'll see you all then for the next batch on Promotional Whitenoise.
Jesus, he knows me, and he knows